Bob Marley called Chris Blackwell Blackheart Man. It was a complicated nickname, one that carried simultaneously the weight of trust and the edge of suspicion. Blackwell was a white Jamaican who had grown up on the island, signed Marley to Island Records in 1972, and given him something almost no record executive of that era gave a black artist from Jamaica: creative control, a real budget, and the assumption that what he was making was worth the world's attention. What Marley built with that, and what Blackwell understood about him that the rest of the industry had missed, is one of the most consequential partnerships in the history of popular music. Neither man fully trusted the other. Neither man could have done what he did without the other. That is the story this video tells. Chris Blackwell was born on June 22, 1937, in London, but raised in Jamaica, the son of a wealthy Anglo-Irish family that had deep roots on the island. His childhood was not the childhood of someone who would go on to run a record label. It was the childhood of someone who absorbed Jamaica, its music, its culture, its specific social tensions from the inside. He founded Island Records in Kingston in 1959, at the age of 22, initially to distribute Jamaican music to the growing West Indian community in Britain. He moved the company to London in the early 1960s and built it into one of the most significant independent labels of the era, signing artists including Cat Stevens, Traffic, and eventually Free and Bad Company. But Jamaica never left him. When Bob Marley walked into his office in 1972, Blackwell understood exactly what he was hearing. Robert Nesta Marley was born on February 6, 1945, in 9 Mile St. Ann Parish, Jamaica, the son of a white Jamaican plantation overseer and a young black Jamaican woman. He grew up between rural St. Ann and the Trenchtown neighborhood of Kingston, one of the poorest areas of the capital, where the music that would become reggae was developing out of ska and rocksteady in the yards and streets. Trenchtown produced musicians the way it produced everything else, under pressure, without resources, with an urgency that came from necessity rather than ambition. Marley absorbed the Rastafari faith there, the politics of resistance, and a musical language that was inseparable from both. By the late 1960s, he had formed the Wailers, with Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, 3 men from Trenchtown, building something that would eventually reach every corner of the world. The Wailers had been recording in Jamaica since the early 1960s, working with producer Lee Scratch Perry and releasing music on Jamaican labels that circulated within the island and among Caribbean communities in Britain. The records were not unknown. Within Jamaica, the Wailers were significant figures, but the international music industry had not found a framework for reggae, and the attempts that had been made to bring Jamaican music to a wider audience had largely involved smoothing out the elements that made it distinct. When Marley and the Wailers arrived in London in 1972, they had been dropped by their American label CBS. After 2 albums that had not performed commercially, they had a meeting scheduled with Chris Blackwell. What they needed was someone who understood what they were and did not need it explained. Chris Blackwell gave Bob Marley and the Wailers something unusual: an advance of £8,000 and the instruction to go make the record they wanted to make. In interviews, Blackwell has described the decision as straightforward. He had heard the music, he understood the music, and he believed the way to bring it to a wider audience was not to change it, but to present it on its own terms, with better production. The album that resulted, Catch a Fire, released in 1973, was not a compromise. It was reggae, the rhythms, the bass, the Rastafari themes, recorded and presented as if it deserved to be taken as seriously as any rock record of the era. Island packaged it in a sleeve designed to look like a Zippo lighter. It was distributed through rock music channels. The audience it was aimed at had never heard anything like it. What Chris Blackwell grasped about Bob Marley and about reggae that the rest of the international music industry had missed was not complicated, but it was rare. He understood that the music did not need to be translated for a Western audience. It needed to be heard by one. In interviews, Blackwell has spoken about Marley as someone whose music carried a political and spiritual weight that was entirely legible without context. That the feeling of what Marley was doing crossed language, crossed culture, crossed the specific Jamaican references that ran through every song. He positioned Marley not as a world music curiosity, but as a rock artist in the broadest sense. Someone making music about power, resistance, love, and faith that belonged on the same stages as the biggest acts Island had ever signed. That positioning was a choice. It was also, as the decade demonstrated, correct. Between 1973 and 1976, Bob Marley and the Wailers released Catch a Fire, Burnin, Natty Dread, and Rastaman Vibration in rapid succession. Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer departed after Burnin, leaving Marley as the undisputed center of the project. The tours that accompanied these records introduced him to audiences in Britain, the United States, and eventually across the world. Audiences who responded to the music with an intensity that surprised even those who had believed in it. No Woman, No Cry, Redemption Song, Get Up, Stand Up, Exodus. The catalog that accumulated across those years was one of the most sustained bodies of work any popular musician produced in that decade. The 1976 Smile Jamaica concert, performed 2 days after an assassination attempt at Marley's Kingston home, became one of the defining images of what he represented. An artist who understood that what he was doing was larger than music. The nickname Blackheart Man was not purely affectionate. Those close to Marley during the Island years have described a relationship that was productive and genuine, but not without friction. Marley was aware, consistently and explicitly, of the history of black artists whose work had been controlled, diminished, or profited from by white executives and white-owned labels. That awareness ran through everything he did, including his relationship with Blackwell. In interviews, Blackwell has acknowledged the complexity of his position. A white man from a privileged Jamaican background, profiting from the music of a black Rastafarian artist whose entire philosophy was built on resistance to exactly that kind of arrangement. What kept the relationship functioning was, by most accounts, the fact that Blackwell consistently delivered what he had promised: creative autonomy, genuine belief, and results. In 1977, Bob Marley and the Wailers released Exodus. The album spent 56 consecutive weeks on the British charts. Time magazine named it the album of the 20th century in 1999. It contained Jamming, Waiting in Vain, Three Little Birds, and One Love, songs that had, by the time of Marley's death, become among the most recognized pieces of popular music ever recorded. Blackwell has described in interviews the period of Exodus as the moment when it became clear that what they had built together had exceeded anything either of them had originally imagined. The music had crossed every boundary the industry assumed existed between Jamaican reggae and global popular music. What it had not crossed was time. Bob Marley was diagnosed with cancer in 1977. He died on May 11, 1981. He was 36 years old, and what Chris Blackwell said about that loss in interviews conducted across the decades since has never sounded like the language of professional grief. Bob Marley died on May 11, 1981, in Miami, of cancer that had spread from his toe to his brain and lungs. He was 36 years old. In interviews conducted over the 4 decades since, Chris Blackwell has spoken about Marley's death in terms that those familiar with both men have described as genuinely personal. The loss of someone whose trust Blackwell understood he had been given carefully and did not take lightly, Island Records continued to steward Marley's catalog after his death. The estate, managed by the Marley family, has grown into one of the most valuable in music history. The music Marley made in 9 years with Island has sold hundreds of millions of copies worldwide. Blackwell has said in various interviews that Bob Marley was the most important artist he ever worked with. He has not qualified that statement. The question of what each man gave the other does not have a simple answer. What Blackwell gave Marley was access to recording budgets, to distribution networks, to audiences that Jamaican independent labels could not reach, and to a framework that positioned reggae as something the world should take seriously. Without Island Records, the specific form that Bob Marley's global reach took would not have been possible. What Marley gave Blackwell was the most significant artistic and commercial relationship of his career, a body of work that defined Island Records as much as Island Records defined it, and a legacy that has outlasted everything else either man was associated with. The tension in their relationship, the Blackheart Man nickname, the awareness of history that ran through it, was not incidental. It was part of what made the music what it was. Two men, one of the most unlikely partnerships in music history. Chris Blackwell heard something the rest of the industry had missed. Bob Marley built something the world had never heard. What they made together, in 9 years, across 8 albums, against every assumption the music industry held about what global popular music could be, changed the terms of what was possible. Who needed the other more? Tell us in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories like this one, subscribe. There's more where that came from.